You are listening to Talking Africa, the podcast that deconstructs the news from the continent, brought to you by the Africa Report. My name is Nicholas Norbrook. To sign up to our daily briefing and for a wealth of African news, comment and analysis, do head to theafricareport.com for more. Now, we hear a lot about the East Asian development experience. But what is the African development experience? A new book by Carlos Lopes tries to fill in the gap. It's called Africa in Transformation, Economic Development in the Age of Doubt. You can find Carlos Lopes on Twitter at Lopes Insights. That's Lopes, then the word insights all together. Lopes had a long career at the United Nations, culminating in running the UN Economic Commission for Africa in Addis Ababa. Since then, he has worked as one of the quiet champions of the African Continental Free Trade Zone, working with the African Union to hammer out the complex series of treaties and negotiations, and he's currently a professor at the Nelson Mandela School of Governance at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Lopes says that Africa might as well be exporting jobs instead of creating them. All the high-value activity remains something that happens outside of the continent. Africa's age-old grappling with the difficult issue of structural transformation remains unsolved. We talk about how ethno-nationalism is getting in the way of the kind of cohesive states that Africa needs to drive development, and much, much more besides. Now, there's a book I mentioned early on, and I'm glad to have a chance here to give its name. It's called How China Beat the Poverty Trap by Yuan Ang, published by Cornell University. So, please enjoy this conversation with Carlos Lopes. One of the issues that I know is close to your heart, the enduring lack of structural transformation of African economies. As you say early on, it must be, and it is painful for Africans, be they leaders or wherever they find themselves, to have had 200, 300, 400 years of colonialism, be exporting all their raw materials, and to still be doing that today, to still be sending now over to the east, towards China mostly, their raw materials, still stuck in this dead end of exporting products that keep on losing value, as it were, and never quite escaping the poverty trap. Obviously, that's not true in all cases, but it does affect a good 80% of the continent, I'm sure. The thinking on how to effect this structural transformation. Have you seen that change dramatically since, say, the 1970s?
Well, if we take into account the level of dependency on exports from commodities as normally established by the data from UNCTAD, we still have about 35 African countries in the highest dependency category, which is really quite tragic, because that means that you have more than 80% of your exports depending on commodities, and for most countries, one commodity, which is even worse. And in fact, what we are witnessing is an exporting of jobs, because more and more the global value chains have been able to add to the value other dimensions that are related to intellectual property, supply chain, refinement, and the like, branding, etc., that get even more out of the commodities if you are able to transform them. So Africa distance in relation to these global value chains is accelerating. And that's why, measured in terms of manufacturing value addition, which is the way the economists do, the percentage of Africa's combined GDP from this particular category is not increasing but decreasing. Obviously, one can say that in percentage, it's just one way of measuring it, because obviously the economies of Africa have grown quite considerably. In fact, the last 15 years, they have grown more than twice their size. And one can also say that the population has grown exponentially. So therefore, percentage is just one way of cutting the cake. But still, it's unsatisfactory, and it just shows that we are not doing enough transformation.
There's a book which came out last year, maybe the year before, called How China Escaped the Poverty Trap. The name of the author I don't have in front of me, but it was very interesting because it says China, at the beginning of its transformation, really into the global juggernaut that we know today, China didn't have the expertise of the Japanese technocracy, who were able to do their picking winners from the get-go. Likewise, they didn't have the experts in South Korea, although I think South Korea probably had a bit less than Japan did. They had sort of social relations, as they call it, and so she argues quite convincingly in this book that what helped China in the early stages was not to have these perfect institutions, but to have quite weak institutions, and to improvise and to have sort of general directives coming from the top, coming from Beijing, and then the local officials on the ground, they had to just they had to get the economic growth by however means they saw fit, and they would cut themselves into the benefits from that. We've seen problems later down the road in terms of municipal debt traps and farmers being pushed off lands because local officials are trying to sell off to build property. But nevertheless, there was this great innovation and improvisation of development in China all throughout the 80s and 90s, by which time there was enough wealth to create institutions which allowed them to do more sophisticated kinds of industrial policy, which led them to a new wave of growth and so on. And then China is where it is today. Is there an argument that Africa, which also often lacks a technocratic elite, should they be looking at doing something similar? Countries which aren't able to do some kind of sophisticated industrial policy from the get-go, should they just try and improvise using the institutions that they already have, weak as they might be, but just to sort of get on with it?
Well, what is interesting in that narrative is the realization that some degree of improvisation, and also not having the right institutions immediately during your takeoff period, are not impediments to progress. But there is another more, I think, realistic exception of what happened in China, which is the realization by Deng Xiaoping that if Chinese were very successful abroad, meaning in Singapore, in Hong Kong at the time, in Taiwan, and of course also the minority Chinese in countries like Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, if they were so successful, why was the continental China, the People's Republic of China, so trapped into poverty? And, his dialogue with Lee Kuan Yew have been recorded in terms of the different interviews given by Lee Kuan Yew himself. That basically, made the case for the special economic zones and special attributes given to slices of China that were close to the coast that would experiment different types of institutions, different types of arrangements, different types of incentives that were to be known later as the one country, two systems. That, basically make case to demonstrate that the issues were more policy related than anything else. And if you had the right policies, the right combination of incentives, things could happen even in a country like China with all its complexity. And I think probably both narratives are right. But I think the latter one that I was just describing is the one that really propelled the export-oriented model. And this export-oriented model gave, quite prominent status to special economic zones. But what we know from the literature is that countries that have experimented with special economic zones have mostly failed to have results that were obtained in China. So it's not a panacea, but it does demonstrate something else that I think is more important, which is that you need incredible political determination to make these things happen. Industrial policy is only successful if the state plays a key role, but it's not the role that normally most states like to play or know to play. It's a role that is a much more sophisticated interventor into transformation, and that's what were to be known as the role of industrial policy in structural transformation, which is what I'm defending for Africa in the book.
One of the things that the sort of the chicken and egg things that is frustrating to those of us who are fans of industrial policy is the difficulty of the state itself in Africa. And you have a very interesting chapter on the effect of, the 1884 Franken engineering of these new countries, really, which purely depended on imperial appetites, created these ex nihilo states packed with all kinds of differences. How is it possible to have
I think most of the states post-independence were struggling to legitimize themselves by having the right credentials ideologically, and the ideology of the moment was Pan-African. They had to demonstrate that Pan-Africanism. They had to demonstrate, sort of their position in relation to the external actor. And insofar as the internal actors were concerned, they were really trying to build a nation with the understandings of the time that a nation state was the way to go. And I think building a nation became an attempt to have something similar to what other parts of the world have been able to achieve. And of course, a lot of it was artificial, and we end up with all kinds of between cynical and weird attempts into integrating people.
What's the weirdest one for you?
I think probably there are lots of candidates actually for the weirdest one, but probably the one that takes the prize is DRC, the current DRC, at the time Zaire. But I think that what was really fascinating to witness was how in all those debates, the issue of economic transformation got completely forgotten. You will see that in most countries, what was being implemented in terms of economic policy was the leftovers of the colonial administration for each one of the colonies. So they had, during the last period of colonization, most colonial administrations had developed quite good plans and quite good attempts into, transforming the economies of these different countries and territories beyond the commodities trap. This is my reading. If you look into how most countries, started to have, the beginnings of infrastructure for industrialization, the way the agriculture was getting much more productive, and one can even be as I would say, controversial as to say that the examples of both Rhodesia and South Africa demonstrate what I'm saying in quite graphic ways, because, the countries, Cote d'Ivoire, there are countries that were much